do you think that there's any important aspect of consent and tacit consent there, in the sense that they'll argue that you've tacitly consented by using the roads? And would you say, well, you need express consent, or do you use a different tactic there?
Yeah, the roads are the ones that come up all the time. It's like, hey man, where would the roads come from? And well, yeah, it's like human beings, 40,000 years ago, were waiting for the state to build roads so we can move from one place to another. Yeah, right. Sure. That's how it works. No, it doesn't work like that. And in fact, historically, as we know, the railroads were all built privately. The roads, turnpikes were built privately, the highway and so on, by and large. Uh, so, uh, uh, and as I can't remember who it was, pointed out a long time ago, the lighthouse, which seemed like public goods, were actually paid for by those who owned the mooring rights in the harbor. So if you came in there, you had to pay, and some of that money went to supply the lighthouse, which meant the harbor was safe, so you would use it. So what's the big deal? There are ways in which we can do these things without having, as it were, to make tacit consent. But here's the interesting thing. I mean, there are some limited circumstances in which you can consent, you can contract by a course of action. They're extremely limited. So, both here and in the United States, if I go into a restaurant, sit down, somebody hands me a menu, I say, I will have the sirloin and some French fries, lots of them, and so on. And that's great. They bring it to me and it's great, and I eat it. And when I'm done, I go, oh, thank you very much. And I get up to walk out the door. And the person goes, oi, hang on a second, you haven't paid. And you go, pay? Who said anything about paying? I just came in and sat down and said, give me some of the stuff, and you brought it along to me. I mean, hey, right? Well, no. I mean, unless you're a Martian, okay, who's like, to whom all of this is completely foreign, you think this is some kind of free food distribution center. Everybody understands what goes on here, right? So when you sit down and when you order the food and you consume it, by virtue of that action, there's nothing tacit about it. It's actually quite concrete. You have contracted without the necessity to make any explicit declaration. You don't need to sign a form. You don't say, I hereby, engage that if you supply me with the following food in the circumstances, I will then, life would be impossible with that. But notice, this is relatively trivial, right? I mean, it's important. Eating is obviously important, but the circumstances to which you can contract by means of a course of action are extremely limited. In almost any, you can't buy a TV set. You buy a TV set and you sign a form, the guy hands you a receipt, you hand over the money, and it's a contract. Okay, it's not a very complicated contract. I mean, there's not lots and lots of pages and no lawyers involved, but there's a contract. And even if you buy a newspaper from somebody and you pick it up in your hand while you're talking on the phone, and you've got the newspaper and you hand the guy the $2, whatever, and he gives you the change, a contract is actually taking place. No words, right? So, but for anything of importance, houses, jobs, anything like that, we don't rely on implicit understandings or courses of action. You have to be explicit about the whole thing. So I would suggest that your property and its use and what you're going to be doing with like various goods and services is not a trivial matter, right? It's not something you can kind of implicitly or tacitly agree to. Mm-hmm. It's something you should explicitly or overtly agree to. And so let me give you one more example of how this works. I mean, in Ireland, not so long ago, the local authority, I suppose you like your local town government, supplied some services, including refuse, rubbish collection. It was pretty bad, shoddy, and so on, and ineffective. And you had to pay rates, which were a kind of form of local taxation. And then some years ago, they abolished the rates, but then they increased the overall taxation. Okay. And then it came that we moved into the beginnings of what looked like the glorious dawn for privatization. And the local authority gave up their monopoly, if you like, of their right to collect your rubbish. And so private firms could now do it. And there are about 4 or 5 operating in my locality. And I can choose whichever one I want to make use of. right? And the interesting thing is, compared to the service that the local authority supplied, this is actually quite sophisticated. We've got different colored bins. If you want to, if you're into all that, I'm not, but it doesn't make any difference. Different colored bins, and they come and they charge you by weight and frequency, and they don't just send you a gross bill at the end of the year, which they kind of make up out of their heads. Right, it has to do with the particular service. Now, the nasty thing, of course, that happens is that they reintroduce the property tax. So now, in addition, now I'm paying the property tax, which used to pay for my refuse collection, and now I have to pay for private refuse collection as well. Such is life. But so that's what happens, and I have an, so no one can come. Some bin collectors can't suddenly come from another company and say, "Oh, we're going to empty your bins whether you like it or not, and we're going to send you a bit." No, I've got a contract with them. Explicitly. That's how it works. And you have to admit, in the scheme of things, like rubbish collection isn't the most significant element in your life, but it's important, but it's not that important. And so as you move up the scale, you would expect to see more and more explicit agreements, right? Not tacit agreement. So yeah, tacit agreement, no.